Christos Anesti, Christ is risen, everybody. Indeed, he is risen. Welcome once again this Sunday evening to a wonderful conversation here from Chicago. This is the second Sunday following Pascha, dedicated to the Myrrh-bearing women. This is one of my most favorite, probably my favorite Sundays, besides Pascha, of course, and we have an amazing panel of guest speakers for us to enjoy and learn from. But before I introduce the speakers to you, I do want to invite everyone and remind you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel, like it, share it, make comments even. And I think we hit our 1,000 subscriber mark, so we're kind of growing, and I appreciate everyone's support. And as a reminder, we are trying our best to support our parishes, so please consider making an online gift at chicago.goarch.org/donate. So our discussion today is entitled The Myrrh-bearing Women Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. And I would love the opportunity to introduce to you the three panelists who are going to teach us all an incredible amount of I would say things that we haven't known probably about the Myrrh-bearing women, but also new ways to think about the Myrrh-bearing women today. So our first panelist is Dr. Valerie Karras. Dr. Karras is a retired professor of historical theology and church history with expertise and numerous academic publications in the area of women in the early and Byzantine church. She also is an expert on the theology of sex and gender in the Greek Fathers and orthodoxy and ecumenical and interfaith relations. She's earned a doctorate, well, I would say doctorates, rather, professor from the Catholic University of America and the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. And she's taught at several institutions, including our very own Hellenic College and Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, at St. Louis University, Southern Methodist University, and Washington University. So, Professor, thank you for joining us.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And our second panelist is, I'm going to call her Dr. Anne-Marie Adams. She's about 2 weeks away from officially earning her doctorate, and I know how exciting that is. You're right there, and you've worked hard for it. So I'm proud to call you Dr. Adams today. Anne-Marie, Dr. Adams, leads a graduate program at Northwestern University where she implements academic programming and advises graduate students, manages both academic and financial operations, and oversees student affairs. Anne-Marie teaches graduate courses in Northwestern School of Communication, and her PhD research in curriculum studies focuses on the identity construction of Greek Orthodox women at the intersection of gender, religious, and spiritual identity formation. So that's an amazing bit of research there, and we look forward to reading it when it's completed. Anne-Marie, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you for having me.
And our third panelist is Rachel Pontikis. Rachel is a partner in the Life Sciences Health Industry Group of the Chicago office of Reed Smith, where she represents healthcare entities, including compounding pharmacies, in disputes with the state and federal agencies, counsels these healthcare entities regarding compliance with state and federal healthcare laws, and leads the healthcare aspects of corporate transactions. As a dedicated advocate for women, Rachel has, in her pro bono practice, assisted domestic violence victims, obtained political asylum, and trafficked women expunge their prostitution conviction. So amazing work, Rachel, and thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome.
And so, ladies, Christos Anesti, Christ is risen.
Alithos Anesti.
Alithos Anesti, O Kyrios.
I can't wait. I'm super excited to get going. For all of our guests and those watching, please feel free to ask your questions in the comment area. I will do my best to get to them. I have questions, of course, for the panelists, but I do have my iPad here, and I will be following the questions that come in from the audience. So Professor Karras, could you help us understand who the Myrrh-bearing women are? I mean, we hear about them, we hear hymns about them all the time. Almost every Sunday we hear the Obligataria mention them. But tell us, who are these women, the historical Myrrh-bearing women? Can you tell us what we know about them from the gospel accounts or from the church tradition?
Yes. Thank you, Sebastián. There are a number of women in the tradition of the church who are referred to as myrrh-bearers. If we look at the gospel accounts, we generally see only 2 or 3 women mentioned. St. Mary Magdalene is mentioned in all of the accounts. The most common one mentioned after that is Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, who is distinct from Salome, the mother of James and John. We also have a few others that are listed at various times. But what we see with all of them, we know from the gospel accounts that there were women disciples as well as male disciples, and that these women provided for the ministry and supported the ministry of Christ. So they were essential to his own preaching mission, his work among people. They provided funds out of their own pockets. They traveled in many cases with him. So we see this, I'll talk about this a little bit later, we see this reflected even in our hagiographical and musicological tradition. So we see them not only as myrrh-bearers and even not only as people who were supporting his ministry and who were a crucial part of his ministry, but we also see in all the gospel accounts that these women were there at the crucifixion. Now, the classic icon that we have for the crucifixion shows the Theotokos on one side and the disciple and evangelist John, St. John the theologian, on the other side. But when we look at the gospel accounts, we see that it always talks about these women being there at the crucifixion, looking on, and also looking to see what happens to his body, following behind. So when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus take down Christ's body, and by the way, they are also considered myrrh-bearers, right? They're not myrrh-bearing women, but they are
That's
also
interesting,
myrrh-bearers, right?
Mm.
Because they actually also anoint him at the time of, as he's taken down from the crucifixion. These women follow behind to see where his body is taken to so that they can go and support him. And they go very, as it says, lian proi, very early in the morning on Sunday. Another thing that I think is important about these myrrh-bearers and this idea of these women who are part of Christ's ministry that I think is often overlooked in our own tradition as it kind of spills out, even though it's there in the scriptural record, is the fact that after his death and resurrection, they are part of the community that continues to meet with the apostles. And it's interesting because when you read the gospel accounts, on the one hand, you can understand why the 12 or 11 by that point would be a little bit suspicious of what the women tell him. But it is interesting to see that, for instance, in the Gospel of Luke, when Mary Magdalene, Joanna, who was the wife of one of Herod's assistants, and other women told the apostles about having gone to the tomb and it being empty and seeing the angels. And I'm quoting here from the Gospel of Luke. But these words seemed to them, to the apostles, an idle tale, and they did not believe them. And this is sort of generally the reception that you see them getting. In a couple of the Gospels, you see that Peter, or in the Gospel of John, Peter and John, go to the tomb to see for themselves. But in general, you see that they're not believed in telling this. And this is something that we see kind of going throughout history of women's testimony, women's witness, women's gifts not being recognized quite as regularly. And like I said a minute ago, we see that particularly in Pentecost, because if you look at the Acts account of Pentecost, it talks about the 11 and other disciples being in that upper room. It says, together with certain women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus. And yet, in the traditional icons of Pentecost, the traditional ones in the Greek and Russian traditions, for example, all you see are the 12. It is interesting that at least in the Coptic tradition, you normally see the Theotokos in the middle, with the 12 surrounding her. You don't see other women, you don't see other male disciples as well, but at least you do see her shown in the middle in the Coptic tradition, but you see that very rarely in most other Orthodox traditions.
So obviously from our kind of superficial reading of the scriptures, or just glancing through the scriptures, we know they're there. We understand that they're the myrrh bearers. They go to anoint. But obviously, from what you're telling us, they're way more important than most people understand.
Yes.
During the ministry of Christ, during the crucifixion of Christ, taking care of the body after he's buried, and then being part of the body of Christ, the church, and very important for the community. And so I can only imagine that individuals like that influence the church and give rise to traditions. I mean, people will remember the myrrh bearers. We remember them now, but I can only imagine, like, early on, especially the early church in Byzantium, traditions were probably popping up all over the place and attributing them to the myrrh bearers. So can you tell us anything about, I've heard about the Church of Jerusalem and the myrrh bearers of the Church of Jerusalem. Who were they, and were they influenced, and how were they influenced by the historical myrrh bearers?
Yeah, this is a very interesting order, and as you said, Your Eminence, it comes out of this general commemoration and recognition of these myrrh-bearing women who we see liturgically commemorated in a number of ways. Obviously today, this Sunday, the second Sunday after Easter, we commemorate the Myrrh-bearing, the myrrh-bearing women. There's an appolitikion specifically for them. Some of the regular Sunday resurrectional appolitikia also mention them. For instance, and they're specifically called mathitria, disciples, female disciples, in Tophedron, in the appolitikion for fourth tone. We see them mentioned in the Epipakoi, part of the Matin service, and in most of the gospel readings that are done during Matins, because they're resurrectional readings. And then, as you also said, there are traditions that develop and commemorations for specific myrrh bearers, like Joanna, like Salome, like maybe most importantly Mary Magdalene. I think it's important to mention that in the Eastern tradition, in the Orthodox tradition, she is not understood as a harlot. There's a conflation that occurs in the Western Church of several different women from various gospel accounts, and that's why she becomes known as a harlot in the Western Church. That particularly occurs because of conflating her with St. Mary of Egypt. But in the Eastern Church, she's not, and I think it's important, over against Dan Brown and his Da Vinci Code fiction, and it is that fiction, she's not a romantic appendage to Jesus. She is an apostle in her own right. She bears the title Is Apostolos, equal to the apostles. St. Ambrose of Milan actually calls her Apostola Apostolorum, the apostle of the apostles, or to the apostles. And she is known in our tradition as an evangelist and missionary in her own right. So I think it's important to recognize the continued ministry of these women. With respect to the order that you mentioned in the Church of Jerusalem, this is a very interesting thing that we know about from a 12th century liturgical manuscript, a typikon, that's apparently a copy of something from around the 9th or 10th century. And this is a liturgical order. This appears to be probably an ordained order, ordained in the sense of the lower clergy, like subdeacons and readers. These Myrrh-bearing, these myrrh-bearers, chanted during the Easter celebrations towards the end of Holy Week, Holy Friday, Saturday, Sunday. They helped the patriarch and the other clergy to prepare the tomb. They chanted during services during that time. During the resurrection service itself, they actually sensed the patriarch. They participated in liturgical processions with the other clergy, both upper and lower orders. I would like to read you just a few lines from the typikon that describes some of this. This is my own translation from the Greek. It's talking about the doors of the church being opened and the patriarch together with the clergy entering. This is, of course, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, chanting the Christos Anesti. And it goes on to say, and the patriarch and the archdeacon immediately enter into the Holy Sepulchre, those two alone, with the Myrrh-bearing, the myrrh-bearers, standing before the Holy Sepulchre. Then the patriarch shall come out to them and say to them, to the Myrrh-bearing, rejoice, or greetings, Yere, Christ is risen, Christos Anesti. The Myrrh-bearing then fall down at his feet, and after rising up, they sense the patriarch and sing the Polychronion to him, which is, for those who don't know, it's a kind of pheme. It's a hymn specifically to a hierarch. They then withdraw to the place where they customarily stand. And so that gives you also an indication that they are an established part of the ritual of the church, of the liturgical rites of the church, because they have a particular place where they stand. So we see these women as an important part of the Church of Jerusalem, of the rite for the resurrection services. Their liturgical ministry, or rites, rituals, mimic the actual actions that the Myrrh-bearing performed that we see in the gospel accounts. And I think it's very interesting to note just how involved they are liturgically. So that 1,000 years ago, we had women doing more liturgically, acting at the tomb, at the altar, with the clergy as an order either consecrated or ordained, than we have today in our modern era.
Well, we'll get into that a little later, because we will get to the modern era. But you are correct. I mean, it's incredible to see, indeed, how involved women were. Just this a small example just lets us kind of just imagine what else they were doing that they're not doing today. But I also appreciate the kind of bringing us back to the scriptures, and as you were retelling the typikon, the rubrics of what their actions were, it actually is very much aligned with the myrrh-bearers finding Christ. Once they realize it's him, they fall down to his feet, and he says, "Here, don't be afraid." And it models exactly the events that occurred in the sepulchre, almost a millennium earlier. But okay, so let's transition now from antiquity, Byzantium, through the rest of history a little bit. So, Anne-Marie, can you help us further trace the history of women's leadership, and as it pertains to our conversation today. And if you can specifically, can you tell us what you see in terms of, how the Myrrh-bearers influence this?
Yeah. So as we discuss the leadership roles of women in the church, I think it's an important distinction that we recognize the ways in which we view leadership today is vastly different than the way it has been throughout history. Most certainly different than the time in which the Myrrh-bearers witnessed Christ's resurrection. While historically, women were not at the forefront of church ministry in the conventional ways that we imagine leaders to be, for thousands of years, women have worked tirelessly supporting the work of the church. We acknowledge that salvation required the willingness and work of Mary. The resurrection was first proclaimed by a group of women disciples. We know that throughout the earliest history of our church, women were apostles and evangelists. The female diaconate that Valerie mentioned was a service-oriented role. There, women were ministering to other women, which was and still is important. So similarly to today, women in the early church performed leadership roles, but without the formal titles. Now, when we think about what leadership meant in the context of the Myrrh-bearing women, I suspect they didn't even think that what they were doing was at all reminiscent of leadership. They brought funeral spices and ointment to finish committing Christ's body to the grave. But this was an expression of deep, deep care. And throughout Christ's ministry, they cared for and they supported him. So venturing out to Christ's tomb required an even deeper level of care and bravery. That's what we now today recognize as servant leadership, right? You're leading through serving. So their objective was to care for Christ. It was not to get the recognition, but by virtue of their work, they witnessed Christ's resurrection. And each of the Myrrh-bearing women were different and unique. They had their own story, personality, strengths, and unique gifts. Together, they represented this coalition of amazing strength, courage, love, and compassion, descriptions that we absolutely attribute today to leaders. So historically, women were leaders in the church. They served critical roles, with the Myrrh-bearing women being models of servant leadership.
Indeed, you mentioned servant leadership, and it's almost like a catchphrase now. Everyone's saying, yeah, servant leadership, servant leadership. And to think that, the Myrrh-bearers were doing this, it was part of who they were. They weren't struggling to come up with a description of leadership. I mean, they cared about service.
Right.
And through their intentional, thoughtful, authentic, passionate service, they became leaders and the examples for so many, not only women, I would say so many people, men and women. They're the example. But what would you say in your studies, especially, is the relationship now between the Myrrh-bearing women and Orthodox women today? Is there a connection? I mean, have we lost that tradition? Are we just too far apart, too far away from, disconnected from the Myrrh-bearing women, or have they been able to influence Orthodox women today?
Absolutely, they've influenced us today. We typically consider the work of women as a more behind-the-scenes effort to do the invisible labor that we talk about so often that women are called to do. They're caring for the elderly, giving birth, raising children, literally giving every ounce of their physical, mental, and emotional selves for others. This is sometimes just thought of as what women are, right? That they embody the caretaking responsibility. In some instances, I think this is a part of acculturation, and there's something beautiful about that, that we care for other people. But there are certainly more to women than their labor. Today, women continue to be Myrrh-bearing women, taking care of the body of Christ, the church. I think if you were to ask people to describe the role of women in the Orthodox Church in very broad terms, I suspect that many would say that women do the prep work and the event execution. They teach Sunday school and serve the community, that they're the philanthropic arm of the church. And in many ways, that's very true. We also have, though, presbyteras who do incredible work and are supporting their husbands in myriad of ways so that they can preach the word of God. Women are on parish councils. That wasn't always a given historically. They're on Metropolis councils. They're leading initiatives, right? They're leading initiatives that are crucial for the preservation of our church. And in many ways, many of us are still doing this while taking care of the home, raising kids, managing careers, and acknowledging that in most cases, we're not limited by these traditional gender roles. Women are still functioning in a servant leadership type of way, and that's a very important role. The church could not function without them. Having said that, and while acknowledging the work women are doing, I think we're very lucky because parishioners, clergy, hierarchs like yourself are recognizing that we need to think critically about the spaces and places that exist within the church for women, or more specifically, places and times when we haven't thought enough about the female perspective and need to. And so by making spaces for these conversations, clergy and hierarchs are being allies to Orthodox women, which is important for our growth. We need to think critically about the role of women, where we were historically, how we've evolved, where we're going, because without that discussion, we can't progress.
Yeah, and I think the we can't progress. It's not just women can't progress, right? It's everybody, we as a church cannot progress, and progression, there are all these words that are taboo now, progress. And if we can use that word to define coming closer to Christ, right? That is spiritual progress. I mean, we all need to, walk together, and you're absolutely right. We can't progress closer to Christ if it's just the men who are working on that, or if it's just the men. It has to be the men and the women. And so we have to intentionally highlight the special ministry of women in the church. So we talked about antiquity. We talked about women and their identity and how they're perceived and their ministry in the church. But the fact is, the church is the body of Christ, and it's not just a building. It's not just when we wear our Sunday best and go to, Saints Peter and Paul, or Holy Apostles, or, St. Nicholas, or St. George, or any church. The church is present everywhere because we are part of that body of Christ, and we are in the world. So I'd like to shift a little bit now and kind of look at women, Orthodox women, and what they've done in the world to shape the world. So Rachel, can you just tell us, as a professional, as a lawyer, how orthodoxy has informed your approach to work? I mean, I read a little bit of your bio, and it's impressive, and I can kind of think of how the church has informed it. But please, why don't you tell us a little bit more about how the church has impacted your work? You're muted, Rachel.
Of course, I'm muted. Okay. So I wanted to say yes, absolutely. And just to pick up from what Anne-Marie said about creating spaces for women, I prepared something a little general, but it's against the backdrop of I am generally, in many, many rooms, the only woman in the room. So when I come to that room, I always have an awareness that I am speaking for all other women, and I'm being judged in the profession for all women. So I will be in a room, but I will know that I'm getting judged for everyone who's coming after me. So that it's a weight, but it's a weight that I accept and I bear, and I know that that's an important part of why I sit in the rooms I sit. So how Orthodoxy has shaped my approach, I think I think about it as I come to bear witness to the truth. That's how I think about being an attorney. Although there are many, many jokes, the truth is being an attorney is a very noble profession. It's an enormous responsibility. And it's a responsibility to help people. That's why I became an attorney, because I'm fundamentally a helper. And I felt called to help people. But you can't just help the powerful. You also have to help the powerless, because in your responsibility, that's part of it. So when I thought of bearing witness, I thought of two principles that I take from Orthodoxy into the profession. And the first one is one of respect. Be respectful. These principles sound very, very simple, but oftentimes in practice they're not. And I will just give a simple example. So as part of my pro bono practice, I've represented trafficked women who are going to vacate their prostitution convictions because they've been trafficked. And if you're trafficked and meet the definition of trafficking in several states, including Illinois, you can get the conviction vacated. And that's important because prostitution convictions are felony convictions. So that means you can't get a job, you can't rent an apartment, you literally cannot leave that life. So when I would set up client conferences for these clients, I would set them up like any other client. We'd go into the conference room I always use, order in the lunch that the firm pays for, the client would come. And the first thing I would say to these women is understand that we are all in this together. Because what society has done to disrespect you, they don't just disrespect you, they also disrespect me as a woman. And when you're disrespected, I'm disrespected. And although you think we sit in different positions, we don't. So I would say, I'm sorry this happened to you. And what I will be able to do for you will be very small and unsatisfying, but I will seek to do my part. And I would hear back from the organization that I was working with, and they told me to be welcomed into a, law firm, a part of the establishment, to be given the conference room and the lunch and that kind of treatment. Those women felt welcomed back into society. And so to me, I didn't even think about this. This wasn't even a big deal. It just was what I did for these conferences. And when it was commented upon, I thought, okay, yes, what was the principle there? Just one of respect. Just respect everyone's humanity, acknowledge their humanity. And in my business, that means respect their problems. And, you hold that problem with them. That's part of being an attorney and part of your ethical and moral responsibility. So that is one way in which I bear witness. The second way is integrity. Again, this one sounds easy, not that easy. Basically, just I feel I have to tell the truth. And that means don't lose sight of what the truth is. And sometimes that can get difficult because sometimes I have to be the bearer of bad news, or I'm telling people things they don't exactly want to hear, or news they don't like, or internally maybe I'm pointing out an injustice. But I'm very committed as an attorney, as an Orthodox Christian, as a woman to tell the truth. And anyone who has any dealings with me and all of my clients, they know this and they appreciate that about me. But that is a piece of bearing witness, is really to tell the truth. And it's a way to protect integrity, because there's very few things that you have in life, and your character is extremely important, especially as an attorney, as an officer of the court. You need to protect your integrity. And it starts with tiny, tiny infractions, which is why I guard my integrity with my life, because once you start down that road, it can become very easy to continue down that road. So those are the two principles that are basic Orthodox principles that I incorporate every day into my practice, which are respect and act with integrity. And especially being the only woman in a lot of these rooms, because I know that my actions are then going to be representative of other women, that I have to adhere to those principles.
So respect and integrity, two words that I'm sure if we look in the scriptures, we can find them, or some translation of them. But I mean, they were central to the Myrrh-bearers, but also to Christ. Love your neighbor, love your enemy, actually, right? Treat them with respect. Maybe that's one way to translate that. Love your enemy today. I love the image that you gave of helping your clients carry their burden or their weight. They reminded me of Peter's Cyrene, helping Christ carry his cross. And each of us needing to do that for each other. Now, the churches in the world it's not of the world, but it's in the world, and it's called to care for the world, to help transform the world. And so how would you, again, as an Orthodox Christian woman who's a professional in the world, how do you minister? How do you bring that care of the myrrh bearers in the world today?
Well, there's external things that I do, sit on committees, and I can describe a little of that. And then there's kind of a more general internal. So in terms of externally, I believe that as an attorney, as an Orthodox Christian, I take my job of doing pro bono work very seriously. So I sit on several boards. I have sat on boards during my career. I was worked with the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation. I currently sit on the board of Culture Reframed. I've done work representing domestic violence victims, getting political asylum. I represented 2 groups of minor girls against Joe Francis and the Girls Gone Wild companies on civil sexual exploitation and anti-child pornography charges. And I also did the work helping trafficked victims. So there's that piece. And I think that piece is important, and I can't overstate that. But then there's another piece that I think people don't think about as much, which is equally as important, which is really leading by example. And the leading by example is important because it teaches whoever you're in the room with how they should behave. For example, with my teams, I'm always very appreciative and express my gratitude. I try to create a culture of gratitude on my teams so that I know everyone is working very hard, from the people in the mailroom to my number 2 attorney. They're putting in a lot of time, and I have to show my gratitude, whether or not the client does. I show my gratitude to my team. I show gratitude to everyone who works for me. And I mean, I learned that, and also to my opponents. Sometimes I'm in very adversarial and contentious spaces. I remember when I was interning, I went to a closing with my dad, and I remember how respectful he was to opposing counsel. I am always respectful, no matter how contentious the situation, no matter what is happening. I'm always going to behave in a respectful manner with my opponents because I'm leading by example. And that burden is even stronger because, again, I'm one of very few women, if not the only woman in the room. So that's what piece of the leading by example. And kind of also on top of that is, I feel that it is my moral and ethical responsibility and religious responsibility to pull up other women with me, which is hard because there's a lot of forces acting against that if you work in a male-dominated profession, which I do. So I take extra care to do my duty to mentor those women, to sponsor those women, to listen to those women, to have an open door policy for women attorneys to be able to talk to me and so that I can share my experience. So there's external, which is important, but there's also what you do every day that is really critical because that leading by example is going to show others how they can do it and how they can do things successfully.
I think, I don't even know where to begin with that. There's so much that you said, but what strikes me the most is how intentional you are in mentoring, in thanking, in lifting people up, in having your open door policy, especially for the women at the firm. I mean, it's a heavy cross to bear, for sure. I'm sure you're kind and respectful and you give everyone equal amount of time, but you're intentionally going that extra mile to help, the women who will come after you, not after you, like to attack you, but who will follow you in your footsteps. I mean, you are setting the example for generations to come, and as the myrrh bearers did, right? You are active, dynamic, Orthodox Christian women. You are who you are because of these myrrh bearers who maybe they weren't thinking about it, that they would be influencing, a Valerie, an Anne-Marie, and a Rachel in the Midwest, but they have, and each of you in your own way, whether it's through teaching or guiding students or defending someone in court, you are paving the way for future generations of women. And so I know we said that we would announce something today, and I'm really excited to do that. But before we announce the initiative in the Metropolis, I do want to maybe explain how this came to be, okay? So I've been ordained since 2003, a deacon for about 7 years and a priest for 8 years, and now as a Metropolitan for a little over 2 years. And as a deacon, I really just observed I was a deacon. My role was to observe. It wasn't to be involved in too much of the work. It was to assist and facilitate, but you would observe a lot of things. And on occasion I would see in these high level meetings, women, they were at the table, but not more often than not, they weren't, like you said, Rachel. Usually it was like one or two, not that they were the token woman, but they just weren't more than there could have been, right? But they were always very dynamic. I always noticed that they were very respectful, but always, truthful and to the point. As a priest in a parish, and then at the archdiocese, I realized indeed, the amazing work women were doing behind the scenes, as Anne-Marie mentioned, the prepping, the serving, all the things that need to get done in order to have a successful program. And that was at the parish. But then at the UN, I mean, we were oftentimes praised by other NGOs at the UN because we had so many dynamic Orthodox Christian women who were waiting to be asked to step up and present and to speak at this high level forum like the UN. And they thought that this was amazing, that a traditional church had would offer women the opportunity to do this. But I found even at the UN, the most dynamic co-workers that we would bring to the table were women. And then as a Metropolitan, I came to Chicago and really knew very few people. Kind of recruited the first, let's say, group of Metropolis Council members, and from there, now we have, I know a lot more people and so forth. But I have to say that in my 2 years here in the Metropolis of Chicago, the most dynamic, the most caring, the most effective co-workers have been women. And especially on the Metropolis Council level, the women members of the Metropolis Council, the previous class, of course, and now this class, are just super focused. They understand what needs to be done, and they have a way of telling me the truth, not hiding, not appeasing me, not flattering the Metropolitan, but kind of keeping me, focused as well. And I just want to, first of all, say thank you to all the women that I've worked with, not only as Metropolitan, but also as a priest. But what I also noticed is that people notice what I do as a Metropolitan. When I enter a room, I've become very much aware of this. I'll walk into a room and people will then turn their heads to see me. And then what they notice is who I talk to right away, who I gravitate to, who comes to me first, who has the most access to me, who sits next to me, how I greet somebody. Do I just, give them a blessing, or do I embrace them? Like, they notice all of these things. And I have, noticed that, unfortunately, the way things are in church spaces, again, mostly men. And so I try to be a lot more intentional in my kind of actions when I walk in, not to just go to the same people, not to sit next to those who people might think I have to sit next to for some reason. And so several months ago, the three of you and many others, we sat together and we said we need to find a way to create more spaces, more opportunities to highlight the special and important ministry of women in the church. And, we I turned it over to you and your group. You built the committee, you recruited. We also have men now part of the committee, which is great. But, and we are proud to announce that we are establishing the Order of the Myrrh-bearing Women of the Metropolis of Chicago. And this new initiative will officially launch in the summer. But the purpose of the Order of the Myrrh-bearing Women is to create a community of practice that's designed to specifically for women across the metropolis. And we want to intentionally create additional spaces and places for women in the church. The Myrrh-bearing Woman will amplify the personal and communal voices of women. And so I'll let you all talk about it more, because this has been, I asked you to take an idea, a small vision, a small idea, and I'm really proud of you all. And why don't you go for it and tell us what it is for you and how it's going to work, and let, maybe give a teaser to the people so that they can talk about it a little bit more. So I don't know, Emery, you want to, but you're muted, just so you know. There you go.
Yep. So I'm really excited about this initiative. His Eminence has asked us to work to close the gap to enhance the leadership and spiritual involvement of women across the metropolis. So under the umbrella of women's initiatives, the Order of the Myrrh-bearing Women is some continuous and long-term work. But like His Eminence said, the goal is for us to create communities of practice designed specifically for women across generations and stages of life. By community of practice, we mean a group of people who share a common passion for what they're doing and learn how to do it better, or learn together as they interact. Women across the metropolis will be able to apply for the Order of the Myrrh-bearing Women to receive a fellowship for programming designed specifically for women at their home parish for 2 years. Over that time, they will take ownership in the planning process by providing input and refinement on their programming. This could be anything, sky's the limit. It could be opportunities to build confidence and connectedness in Christ-centered ways, programming that builds community. If a parish wanted to focus on chanting classes or increased liturgical participation, anything you can think of. His Eminence really talked about wanting to recognize and exalt women for their dedication to the church. And by allowing for these spaces created by women in the church based on their interests, we will, like he said, amplify the personal and communal voices of women, which we perhaps haven't done enough. So this is His Eminence not being tone deaf to what people need, what women want based on their experiences. And as an Orthodox woman, I cannot tell you how excited I am about this, and how proud I am to be a part of a metropolis that finds this work really important, not a check the box type of thing, but something that we know in our hearts that we need to do. So we'll have additional information on this in the coming months, but we're excited and passionate about caring and continuing to care about the church in the way that the Myrrh bearers have.
Well, I will say this, I see little girls in the parishes. They come and greet me, all the children, of course, but sometimes I think, Rachel, you have said to me, your daughter has said, Mama, can I be a priest one day? Or can you be a priest? Or,
Yes.
Our daughters are asking these questions. Of course, they're innocent questions. And, in their mind, maybe I can be a priest. And Valerie, I know you've studied and you've looked at, ordained ministry. To process at this point, but I don't know. I will say, I think that what we can no longer do, and I don't want to ever, if I ever do this, you have to call me out on it, okay? All three of you and your friends. I mean, we cannot use, the ordained ministry as an excuse not to open other doors. Like if that's not possible, okay, then well everything else I can't see in my mind why everything else isn't possible. And so we have to do, as Rachel said, intentionally lift up our young people. Not only the girls, but the boys. They will see, they will, I think, respect the girls more. I mean, they'll see them, as equal, that they're working hard as well, that it's not just baking and cooking and, doing the things that we kind of make fun of in the church, but we want to open up big doors and help the girls rise and become dynamic servant leader women. And so I'm really excited. You all can express this better than I can, the program. I think you've done an amazing job. And, I can't wait to fully announce the details in the coming weeks and months. But I do encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about the program or supporting the initiative. I think Anne-Marie mentioned that we will be giving grants to applicants who wish to become inducted in the Order of the Myrrh-bearers. We're going to need your help. We're going to need the kind of micro grants that you can maybe give to this program, so we can then give and empower these women with funds and resources for them to be successful. And I think that these programs and initiatives, they may start off in one small community or a parish or in the neighborhood, and we may be able to then replicate it and introduce it to the broader metropolis and the church as a whole. So, small grant that we give to a woman who's interested in making a difference can make a difference not only in her parish, but in the entire church. So if you're interested, please email us or contact us at the Metropolis. There's ways to do it. But ladies, thank you so much. I am so appreciative of your time. We spent about an hour together. And I think everyone, I've got a ton of comments here on the Facebook post, but we'll try to answer those. If you can go back to the event on our Facebook post and answer questions as you see them related to your own field. Everyone, thank you for joining us this Sunday evening. I thank you for your time. Again, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Share that with your friends. Subscribe, notifications, likes, leave comments. I mean, we want to make our presence on social media a lot more dynamic. So not just posting, but conversing. And again, please consider making a contribution online to support the parishes that are caring for you and all people in society at chicago.goarch.org// that is donate. chicago.goarch.org/donate. Thank you all. Christos Anesti, Christ is risen.
Christos Anesti.